Hello and welcome to Dining with Death. This episode is on my playlist, Deadly Destinations, where we visit the sites of terrible events. Sometimes they're murders and sometimes they're mass murders. Today I'm coming to you from Fort Myers, Florida, where in 2007 a mass grave was discovered. I'm going to take you on a little tour of the area. We're going to talk about the crime, and of course we're going to eat here. I'm Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Welcome to Fort Myers, Florida. This is where my daughter is doing her medical residency. She's in her second year, and she's at one of the hospitals here in Fort Myers. I've spent a little time in Florida, and what I've noticed most is that it's very distinctly split into groups. We went to nearby Naples on this trip, and it is posh. It reminded me very much of Newport Beach in California, which is very expensive, and Naples might be even more expensive. But then, just a few miles away is Fort Myers, which is very much a blue-collar town. So you see that everywhere, right? Yeah, you do. But I don't know that you see with your eyes the differences as much as you do in Florida, at least with my experience here. For example, no matter what part of Utah you live in, tiny town or big town, rich part or poor part, there is sidewalk, there is curb and gutter. And that's not the case here in Florida. They like it a little more rural than that. It's very much the Florida swamp. It's very beautiful, it's warm, it's pretty, it's lush. My son and daughter live in a very nice neighborhood. Their neighbors all have pools, the homes are worth $500,000, but the neighborhood doesn't feel that way because it's a little bit more rural. The posh parts of Florida are very, very posh. Now, I'm well aware of the jokes people make about Florida, and I'm painfully aware of the political problems here, believe me. But today we are just going to focus on this town and the terrible events that happened here not that long ago. Fort Myers was originally established as a Seminole war post in 1841, and it was then called Fort Harvey. In the late 1860s through the 1870s, it was transformed from a war post to a farming and cattle community. There is a lot of wide open space here, and the weather is nice and warm all year round, making it perfect for growing things. In the late 1800s, Fort Myers became known as a great place to go fishing, and fishermen from all over the eastern United States would come here on fishing trips, hoping to catch the big one. After its official founding following the Civil War, it became a trading post for tobacco, beans, gunpowder, and animal hides. More and more people moved in, and soon there was a community growing up around the trading post. Sadly, during that same time, a lot of the original wooden buildings that used to be in downtown Fort Myers were torn down and replaced with brick and masonry buildings. Many of those buildings are still here. In 1924, the Edison Bridge, named after Fort Myers' favorite winter resident, Thomas Edison, was built to span the Caloosahatchee. The original bridge was long ago replaced by twin bridges, each of them go one way, and the residents use those every day to get back and forth across the water. Fort Myers is kind of a city that sits between other well-known cities. They call it the gateway to southwestern Florida, which is, of course, Disney country. Disney World is about 2.5 hours from here. It's not that close, but you still see the Disney influence all around. In 1904, the Atlantic Coastline Railroad opened, connecting Fort Myers to Punta Gorda. This meant people in Lee County now had access to both passenger and freight railroad service. This is when Fort Myers split socioeconomically. Poor people and African American people came into work as tradespeople and vendors, and the landowners moved into better parts of town. You can still really feel the segregation here. Beachfront property is very, very expensive, and only a mile or so away from that property, you can get very affordable housing. Now, of course, the reason Fort Myers has been in the news more recently is because of Hurricane Ian. My kids had just moved here. They had just purchased their home a few months prior to the hurricane, and let me tell you, it was something for them to live through it. Hurricane Ian hit in September of 2022 and caused some of the worst devastation in modern history. My son and daughter lost parts of their roof, they lost their outdoor bar area, and something like 30 banana and mango trees in their yard, and they were some of the lucky ones. Look at this devastation. And remember, I'm here in spring of 2023. This is 8 months after the hurricane hit, and it still looks like this. According to my kids, this is great compared to what it used to look like. It's now in the rebuilding stage. This used to be just piles and piles of debris that went on for miles. There were boats up in trees and giant chunks of buildings sitting in the middle of the road. There are still a few boats in the trees and a lot of boarded up houses, but as you can see, they are starting to rebuild. See this stretch of beach? This was nothing but very expensive houses and high-end restaurants, shops, and bars. Now, there's nothing here. Broken trees and twisted rebar and chunks of ragged concrete litter the entire area, and even the buildings that withstood the hurricane have construction fencing around them because they're having to redo and reinforce some of the foundations. Everywhere you see a vacant lot, that was a house last year. There was a business there. If you've traveled the coastlines of America at all, you know there's no such thing as vacant beach property. This wasn't vacant until Mother Nature decided to make it vacant. None of these newer-looking structures, quote, survived the hurricane. They're new. They're owned by people who have enough money that they aren't stuck waiting for an insurance payout. They're owned by people who can pay top dollar to get construction crews in here and get them rebuilt. The rest of the folks are down on the list, and that's why you still see so much vacant property here. It will take years to get back to where it once was. It took weeks just to get the power back and drinking water reestablished. The hurricane tore through here like the devil and left nothing but pure and utter destruction in its wake. Hurricane Ian wasn't the first force of nature to cause devastation here in Fort Myers. Back in the mid-1990s, a serial killer was stalking these streets and taking victims, and it took years to get to the bottom of all he had done. On New Year's Day, 1996, a resident is going about his daily routine. He lets his dogs out of the house and begins walking on the trails that run through their large backyard. The dogs stop at the base of a tree and seem interested in something. As the man walks up to the tree, he is stunned to see the dogs sniffing a human skull. He calls his wife, and together they call the police. When the cops arrive, the couple tells them that their dog has been bringing bones home for over a month. They figured they were from a dead deer or a horse that someone had dumped in the swampy area of their lot. The police went to the site and found that there were finger bones, hand bones, feet bones, and yes, a human skull. There was no clothing, no shoes, and no way to identify the person who had been dumped. When the medical examiner looked at the bones, he saw knife marks in the pelvic bones, and therefore the death was ruled a homicide. The victim was labeled as Sarasota County John Doe, and his bones were put into storage in hopes he would be identified at a later date. And he was. Then, on March 7, 1996, a man pulled off Route 75 to urinate. As he walked towards the long grass, he saw a naked man, dead, lying on his back with his arms and legs positioned in the shape of a cross. He called the police and the medical examiner, and it was determined that the man had been there for about 10 days. He had been stabbed to death, but even more gruesome, his genitals had been removed with a knife. Again, the victim had no ID, and he was buried as a John Doe. Just a month later, on April 17, 1996, another skull was discovered in Charlotte County, Florida. As the police searched the dump site, they were shocked to come upon a second body. That body was partially covered with a piece of carpet padding, but one of the officers saw a hand sticking out from underneath it. Both bodies found on this day showed signs of sexual assault, and the first body had been dismembered. This time, however, the police were more fortunate. They were able to quickly identify both victims because their fingers were still intact. They fingerprinted the bodies, and fortunately, both men were in the system. The first body was that of 25-year-old Kenneth Lee Smith. The second body belonged to 21-year-old Richard Allen Montgomery. Richard's mother kept in contact with her son, even though he was struggling and sometimes homeless. A week before his death, Richard told his mother that he had a new friend, and that man was named Dan Conahan. The police, of course, wanted to talk to Dan Conahan. As they were looking for him, they were called to the county jail. There was an inmate named Peyton who wanted to speak with them. He told them that he was in jail for DUI, but there was a reason for it, and it was a doozy. Peyton told the police that as he walked on the side of the road the night before, a man pulled over and offered him money to take nude photos of him while tied to a tree. Peyton was desperate for cash, and so he agreed. As the two men drove out into the forest, the car got stuck in a mud puddle. The man got out of the car and told Peyton to gas it while he pushed. When Peyton looked behind him into the back seat, he saw what was there: rope, duct tape, and a knife. As soon as the car was free from the mud, Peyton gunned it and drove away. He was then pulled over for being drunk behind the wheel. Police couldn't believe what they were hearing, so they ran the plates on the car Peyton had been arrested driving, and sure enough, it had been reported stolen. Who did it belong to? A man named Daniel Conahan Sr., but the man who reported it stolen was Daniel Conahan Jr. Daniel Conahan Jr. was a former military man who had been dishonorably discharged for getting into a fight with a man that he then attempted to sexually assault. Daniel was openly gay and often talked about the fact that he was very angry about the way he was treated for being homosexual. He joined the Navy in 1977 after high school. He was known to be quiet, and he was known to be a loner. He went on to get his license in practical nursing, and he worked in Florida and lived with his parents. The police didn't feel they had enough on Daniel to arrest him for the murders at that time, so they created an elaborate sting operation. A detective who resembled the known victims was wired up and went to hang out at a park that Daniel Conahan was known to frequent. The officer went into the bathroom and Daniel followed him. They struck up a conversation and began to walk through the park. Daniel told the officer he'd pay him $20 for sex, but that he didn't have the money on him. Then the man asked if he could tie the officer up and take photos of him. Of course, the officer was not going to do this, so he made up an excuse and the two parted ways. The police knew this was enough. They followed Daniel and pulled him over. They told him his name had come up in the investigation of the dead men found in the area and asked if he would come in and speak with them. Daniel said yes. The police had been monitoring this entire situation from a nearby motel that was already wired with audio and video, so that's where they took Daniel Conahan. These are still shots from that interrogation video. During the interview, the police informed Daniel that at that moment, other officers were serving a search warrant at his parents' house where Daniel lived, in Punta Gorda. The search warrant turned up rope and pliers and this box cutter. They searched Daniel's car and took a paint chip from it. Why? Because there was a paint chip on one of the victims' pelvis. This is the paint chip right here. While detectives waited for lab testing, two officers were talking about the murders, and the officer from Punta Gorda was shocked to hear his buddy from Fort Myers say, "We had a case just like that, but the guy lived." The officer couldn't believe what he had just heard. This is the victim who got away. He did so by pretending to pass out, and he then went to the hospital. The victim's name is Stanley Burden. The two officers created this photo lineup and took it to the surviving victim. He immediately pointed out Daniel Conahan as the man who had tried to kill him. Daniel Conahan was arrested and taken into custody. As he awaited trial, yet another skeleton was found on May 22, 1997 by a construction worker. Months later, that victim was identified as 24-year-old William Billy Charles Patton. He had been missing since 1993. On October 19, 2000, more skeletal remains were found in Northport, Florida. This victim has never been identified and is known only as Charlotte County John Doe. In August of 1999, Daniel Conahan waived his right to a jury trial. They brought in Stanley Burden, the surviving victim, and he testified. 2 weeks into the trial, the judge found Daniel Conahan guilty of first-degree murder and the kidnapping of Richard Allen Montgomery. He was later sentenced to death. Now, all of this happened in different towns in this area, so why are we focused on Fort Myers today? Because, my friends, what you've heard up to this point is only half the story. It gets so much worse. On March 23, 2007, a land surveyor was working right here, plotting out new parcels for development. As he stepped back into these bushes on a regular workday, just doing his job, he stumbled onto something out of a horror film. There in the swamp lay the bodies of 8 men. There was no clothing of any kind, nor were there personal items, leading authorities to believe the men were all dumped naked. Some of the remains had been chewed by animals, and there was no flesh on any of the victims. Teams of CSI agents were brought in to investigate. You can see them sifting through the dirt here. A few months later, they got their first identification. One of the men was 38-year-old John Blevins. He was a transient. Then they identified 21-year-old Eric David Kohler, who disappeared in 1995. Then investigators identified Jonathan James DeHay, who was 24 years old. Just a few months ago, a fourth victim was identified, 30-year-old Robert Ronald Bobby Sodden of Fort Myers, who disappeared in 1996. The other 4 victims remain unidentified as victims A, B, F, and G. It is always very strange to walk the roads and look at the actual places where people lost their lives and where they were dumped. I try to put myself in the shoes of the killer. I listen to my feet on the road and the wind blowing the trees, and I think those are the same things the killer heard when he was here. I imagine the sounds of his car and the sound of bodies being dragged and then thrown away like trash, and I think, what on earth would make someone do things like this? I've never found an answer. I did, however, find Daniel Conahan very easily on an inmate search. He is at the Maximum Security Union CI facility, and he is on death row. He is still undergoing the appeals process before execution, but when he is executed, I will cover that event on my playlist, Dining with the Damned. This is an evil man who preyed on desperate men who were struggling with addiction and homelessness. He is a sadist, and he is a sick individual, and he is right where he belongs. Now, as we always do on this playlist, we eat in our deadly destination. This is a dark travel playlist, and we always incorporate the culinary scene into the locations we visit. We went out with our kids a couple of nights during our visit. We hit this fabulous spot called Mason's Famous Lobster Roll. We were out walking through the street festival they were having that night. It was great. Lots of live music and vendors. Really a good time. The lobster rolls were rich and savory. The meat was fresh and the bread was toasted just right. This was an amazing little snack we enjoyed while taking in downtown Fort Myers. The street festival was lively and fun, and they had these kids performing the songs they learned at School of Rock. That was my favorite part. I love seeing kids into instruments and learning how to play in a band. After that, we headed to one of the night spots. They had a live band that was really good, but it was so loud. Now, I love me a loud live band, but in a restaurant, usually you want to be able to talk. We couldn't even scream over the top of this band, and so we got to laughing. It was really loud. We had a burrata appetizer and a flatbread. It had some balsamic vinaigrette and vegetables. None of the food was really great. I wasn't feeling very well that night. I had steamed veggies and rice. Might have been the best thing we had on the table. The food was pretty mediocre, but we didn't care. We were having so much fun. Fort Myers is a beautiful place with nice people and amazing weather and a long history dating back to America's early days. It's also home to a monster who took men down on their luck and used them for his own twisted purposes. Thankfully, the police were determined to catch this killer and bring him to justice. This monster wasn't as slick or as smart as he thinks he is. That's usually the case, but it doesn't always mean they get caught. I'm just happy this one did.
Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, Deadly Destinations. Hit the like button if you liked the video, subscribe to my channel if you want to see more from me, and you can always join my Patreon. That is greatly appreciated. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.